Hello and welcome back to part 2 of our exploration of the very first part of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. So we're going to pick up where we left off and continue looking at the chapter and talking about some of the ideas and themes that run through it. "You will want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop £1/crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning." So remember, of course, it wasn't common practice for Christmas Day to be taken as a holiday in Victorian times, but some employers did give the day off. But Scrooge is offering the time off rather reluctantly. He's been quite bitter about it because, as far as he's concerned, rather than seeing it as a paid day of holiday, he's seeing it as paying Cratchit to do no work. And so we see Scrooge dominating Bob Cratchit here. The fact that he can only smile faintly. He can't simply agree that he'll be ill-used because he's got no power here. Scrooge is his employer and has all the money, so all he can do is this rather weak, faint smile because he does feel that Scrooge is being too harsh, but he can't actually come out and say it. He likens the idea of celebrating Christmas to being someone stealing money off the rich, like a pickpocket, a thief. But he does still give him the time off, but rather begrudgingly, and in fact he says, be here early the next day. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of the white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at Blyman's Buff. So what we're seeing here is the clerk heading off home. And yet, we've been told he's quite poor. He doesn't actually have an outdoor coat, an overcoat. He's just got basically a small jacket, a comforter to keep him warm. But it still takes time to play with some boys and have a laugh and joke around, because he's a much more positive character, someone who embodies the spirit of Christmas far more than Scrooge ever would. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile building up in a yard, where it had so little business to be that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out again. So this is really interesting. This is a description of Scrooge's home, and we get this nice bit of personification. So the idea that Scrooge's house is really in an out-of-the-way place. It's amongst the business environment rather than in a residential area. So this reinforces the idea that Scrooge would much rather be surrounded by business and kept away from other people. So by living amongst other businesses and not living near neighbours, he's detaching himself from wider society. So this idea that a young house playing hide and seek, so at some point Scrooge was much more spirited and friendly, but over time what's happened is he's lost his way. So this idea of the house symbolises that. This idea that it's run there when it was young and forgotten the way out again. So Scrooge has ended up there because he himself has forgotten how to be a nicer person. He's got so obsessed with his banker's book, which is what he spends all of Christmas Eve looking at and pondering, that he's in this melancholy state of mind. Melancholy just means sad or miserable. So his life is miserable. We get the repetition of melancholy here. And what he's doing is essentially very un-Christmas-like. He's not really embracing the season at all. It was old enough now and dreary enough for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gateway of the house that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in mournful meditation on the threshold. So it's like we get the personification here, of course, of the winter weather, the idea that the winter is actually sitting at his doorway. That's how cold and miserable this place is. The semantic field of darkness and ignorance again being continued, and dreariness. But it's interesting that Scrooge would rather live in this office block than in a residential area because he wants to keep himself detached from everyone. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It's also a fact that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence in that place. Also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the City of London, even including, which is a bold word, the corporation, alderman and livery. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. So again, we get some direct address to the reader, so some more indirect free speech. Now it's a fact. So it's almost like we're being positioned as someone listening to the story. And the idea of the door knocker is important because this is like a little metal thing you back in Victorian times they didn't have doorbells, they'd have like a metal thing on a knocker that you would lift up and drop onto the surface of the door to bang and get someone's attention. You still see them sometimes even today. But you've seen this door knocker every day without any issue. And that's why we're being told, because now he's going to see Bob Marley's face appear in it. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not in impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard were, but had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. So we get this nice sentence structure here. So we get Marley's face, and then of course Marley's face again here, just to emphasise the fact that he's seeing the ghost. And it's also, the face stands out from the shadows around him. So again, shadows equaling ignorance and darkness and lies and all the kind of bad stuff. But there's a kind of a gloomy, dismal light coming from the face of Marley, which sets it out from the background. But it's a dismal light because Marley was like Scrooge, so he hasn't kind of been redeemed. In fact, he's come there to try and show Scrooge a different way to live his life. And we get a bit of a joke here, this idea that it's similarly here like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. Very odd phrase, but all it means is that a lobster, after death, it starts to kind of lose its colour. So if you put a lobster into a cellar, it looks pale and sickly and ill. So basically, we're being told that Marley's face looks very unpleasant. So this is the kind of the moment where he starts to see the spirits. So although there are 3 main spirits that visit Scrooge, of course we have this 4th one. The very first one is Marley's ghost, which begins appearing in the doorknob. The hair was curiously stirred as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That, and its livid colour, made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control, rather than a part or its own expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. So what we're being told is that, while Scrooge has kind of been taken a little bit aback and shocked by what he's seen, he's kind of dismissed it and pushed on ahead. He's opened the door and gone straight in. And we get this kind of right interesting sentence structure here, which conveys the idea of his brusque kind of speed. Turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. So this kind of short phrases in these long list kind of reinforce the idea that he's doing these things because he refuses to believe what he's just seen. He did pause with a moment's resolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind at first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door, except the screws and nuts that held the knocker on, so he said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed it with a bang. So, even though he's doubting his senses and trying to kind of dismiss what he's seen, he has a moment of resolution, so basically a moment of doubt, where he looks back and checks the door knocker just to be on the safe side and see, did he really see something or not? But when he realises it's just a door knocker in the back of it, he kind of dismisses it and then goes on inside. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. You may talk vaguely about driving a coach and six up a good old flight of stairs, all for a bad young Act of Parliament, but I mean to say you might have got a hard hearse up that staircase and taken it broadwise with the splinter bar towards the wall and the door towards the balustrades, and done it easy. So, quite a lot to go through here. We get a nice little simile, the idea that the bang of the door is like thunder, the idea of thunderclaps that kind of creates a bit of dramatic tension. But also starts to introduce this idea of, divine intervention. But the interesting feature really is more the echo, the fact that we get this description of the echo kind of pealing, so the echo kind of reverberates throughout the whole building. It just kind of really reinforces the idea just how isolated, just how alone Scrooge is, that everything around him is essentially empty and deserted, so the sound just carries through it. So he is very much on his own here. And of course we also see him trimming his candle, basically just kind of what he's doing is pinching it a little bit as he goes, so he's being stingy with the light and kind of getting himself up to bed. And then we get some more indirect free speech. So we get the kind of narrator stepping in as a character again and telling us the idea of Scrooge's staircase was pretty big. So a coach and six means a coach pulled by 6 horses. And there was a kind of an idiomatic phrase that you could drive a coach through a bad young Act of Parliament. So basically, an early draft of a law would have lots of holes in it. It wouldn't be up to scratch. So you could drive basically drive a carriage through it. So he's basically just using that as a turn of phrase. And he's basically trying to use it to say that, Scrooge had a massive staircase. But then we get this kind of slightly sinister imagery of a hearse used to carry dead bodies, and saying that you could take a hearse up sideways. That's how big and wide this staircase was. So again, that kind of huge, enormous stairwell and the kind of booming echo just reinforces the idea that Scrooge is all on his own in this rather enormous place, but he's there, completely isolated. There was plenty of width for that, and room to spare, which is perhaps the reason why Scrooge thought he saw a locomotive hearse going on before him in the gloom. Half a dozen gas lamps out of the street wouldn't have lighted the entry too well, so you may suppose that it was pretty dark with Scrooge's dip. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for that. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his room to see that it was all right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. So, Scrooge is going up the stairs. He's got very little light to work with because he doesn't like spending money on fuel, so he's kind of got used to the gloom, the dark, and again the association of dark with ignorance, which is what's really going on here. But he's still kind of a little bit shaken up. He still thinks he might be seeing things in the dark. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, a small fire in the grate, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold in his head, upon the hob. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in the dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Old fire guards, old shoes, 2 fish baskets, washing stand on 3 legs, and a poker. So we're getting a lot of minor sentences here. So sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, a list of the actual places in his apartment. And essentially what we've been told is he's kind of going around and inspecting his living quarters to make sure that nothing is out of the ordinary. So he's obviously a little bit shaken up by what he thought he saw. But what's interesting here is that the narrator now is kind of entering into the mind of Scrooge, and this is something else that Dickens likes to do. The third person narration allows him to kind of move perspective. So here we have it entering into Scrooge's mind as he starts checking for what he thinks might be an intruder, and we get the repetition of nobody, nobody, nobody. Now on the one hand it just means he's checking to make sure there's no one intruding into his home, but it's also this emphasis again of the idea that he is entirely isolated with no one there around him for friendship or support. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed, nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. So he is clearly shaken up because he's double locked his door, which is not something he normally does. So custom means customary or traditionally. but it's what he typically does. So he's shaken up, locks his door twice just to be absolutely sure no one will get in, gets changed for bed, and then sits down by his meagre fire. And in fact, he's clearly a miser because he won't even be prepared to put lots of fuel on the fire, even for himself. So he sits brooding over it. It's a great verb. It's like thinking quite negatively, quite miserably and deeply. So it's quite a negative word, that one. So this is again, because he is quite a negative, miserable character. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, and paved all round with quaint Dutch tiles, designed to illustrate the scriptures. There were Cains and Abels, Pharaoh's daughters, queens of Sheba, angelic messengers descending through the air on clouds like feather beds, Abrahams, Belshazzars, apostles putting off to sea in butter boats, hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts. And yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like the ancient prophet's rod and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some picture on its surface from the disjointed fragments of his thoughts, there would have been a copy of old Marley's head on every one. Right, well, there's a lot to go through in this section, lots of imagery here, which is all very, very symbolic. I'm going to pick out a couple of the key ones. So this idea of the fireplace being heavily kind of ornate and decorated, it's basically got all these kind of tiles depicting scenes from the Bible and other stories, but some of the most significant ones, Cain and Abel. Well, Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve in the Bible, and essentially this was a story about the two brothers. Cain was a farmer, Abel was a shepherd, and they were asked to make a sacrifice one day to appease God, and essentially one sacrifice was rejected, and so Cain got very, very jealous and decided to murder his brother Abel. And then God, of course, was very upset with this and basically came along and asked Cain where his brother was. And his brother basically said, "I know not. Am I my brother's keeper?" And of course, this kind of rhetorical question, am I my brother's keeper, is the kind of the deeper moral message of that story. This idea that we are responsible for keeping each other. We are responsible for the welfare of others, not murdering others, making sure we care for each other, looking out for each other, whether it's family or other people in society. So Cain was often associated with greed and violence and cruelty, and it was essentially kind of seen in the story as kind of introducing evil into the world. So this is important because that means that Scrooge is being associated with the story of Cain and Abel. So Scrooge himself represents this idea of evil and greed in the world. So this idea of, am I my brother's keeper, kind of runs through the story. Scrooge is being asked to reflect on this idea that is he himself responsible for the people around him? And the answer, of course, according to Dickens, is yes, without a doubt. The other one is kind of interesting, particularly due to the events here, is the story of Belshazzar. So Belshazzar was an advisor and a kind of prophet who went to King Nebuchadnezzar and attended a feast. And while there, during this really lavish feast, the king was kind of indulging in lots of food and wine and so on. This weird ghostly hand appears and starts writing a message of warning in a language that none of them can read on the wall. So the kind of the ghostly appearance of the hand in the story of Belshazzar is very reminiscent, of course, of the appearance of the ghost of Marley that's going to be teaching a lesson to Scrooge. So we have this kind of, in a way, if you know your stories, you've got a little bit of foreshadowing going on here. And this foreshadowing is being delivered through these illusions. Be careful how you spell illusions because it begins with an A, not an I. The one with the I is a kind of a trick, an optical illusion that kind of tricks the eye into believing something that's not there, whereas an allusion is just a reference to another story. So we have a dense amount of references here, lots and lots of them in this section, but perhaps the two most significant ones are the reference to Belshazzar and the one to Cain and Abel, because this idea of, am I my brother's keeper runs through the story. This kind of idea that we are responsible for one another. So let's get on with the story. "Humbug," said Scrooge and walked across the room. After several turns he sat down again. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a disused bell that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked, he saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. So in Victorian times, it was not uncommon to have a system of bells and bell cords running through room to room, and they would go through to like a servants area. So if people wanted assistance in one part of the house, they could ring the bell, and then that would communicate a request to the servants' quarters to send someone to that room. Now this is obviously a redundant system in this house because Scrooge is living in an office block essentially, so this bell hasn't rung in years, but now it starts to ring, so introducing this idea of the supernatural, which is obviously starting to scare Scrooge. But of course bells also have a kind of religious significance too, this idea of this particular instrument associated with religion, so there's an echo here of the kind of Christian morality coming into the story, because of course these ghosts aren't frightening supernatural forces so much as they are kind of representatives of God and morality and goodness that are here to teach Scrooge a lesson that will ultimately benefit him. This might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun together. They were succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard the noise much louder, on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." His colour changed though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door, and passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. So this, the idea of the chains, of course, we're going to see a bit more about this dragging chains later, so we will move on for now. But interestingly, when Marley's ghost finally does appear, the flame leaps up momentarily. And again, light and heat and all those things associated with truth and morality and goodness. So in a way, this dying flame, which is it's dying of course because Scrooge is being stingy with the light, but also because symbolically Scrooge is ignorant, but this flame leaps up momentarily because of Marley's appearance, because Marley is representing that truth and knowledge and that learning that he's going to bring to Scrooge to help teach him to be a better man. The same face, the very same. Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling like his pigtail and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail, and it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chill influence of its death-cold eyes, and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous and thought against his senses. "How now?" said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much," Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." He was going to say "to a shade," but substituted this as more appropriate. "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation, but the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to it. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know." said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" "Because," said Scrooge, "a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an undone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." So, quite a lot to go through here, but we'll kind of come back to some of this. But essentially, Scrooge is thinks that he's simply got indigestion. He's refusing to believe the evidence of his senses. That's what he means by more of gravy than of grave. So he thinks he's eaten something bad, and it's making him hallucinate. Interestingly, the appearance of Marley, he's covered in cash boxes and keys and padlocks, all these things associated with locking away money. And a ledger is an account book for keeping records of cash. So all of the sins that he committed in terms of his greed and stinginess are now kind of wrapped around him as a kind of punishment. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is that he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow in his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed glazed eyes in silence for a moment, would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for though the ghost sat perfectly motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated as by the hot vapour from an oven. So the ghost is unsettling Scrooge. He's trying to kind of maintain a sense of humour because, of course, he's still not quite sure he believes what he's seeing. But interestingly, this idea of the ghost creating its own atmosphere, this infernal atmosphere, and this word infernal is important because as an adjective, anything infernal refers to an inferno, or in this case, hell. So the idea, of course, is that Marley has gone to hell for his sins, and he's got an opportunity to come back here to try and teach Scrooge a lesson before it happens to him too. So this hot vapour from an oven, all this kind of hellish imagery, all associated with Marley, is just a reminder of the kind of sins that Marley has committed. "You see this toothpick," said Scrooge, returning quickly to the charge for the reason just assigned, and wishing, though it were only for a second, to divert the vision's stony gaze from himself. "I do," replied the ghost. "You're not looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it," said the ghost, notwithstanding. "Well," returned Scrooge, "I have but to swallow this, and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug." So this reference to the toothpick is simply Scrooge continuing with his line of the thought that he's seeing things. So he thinks, I've eaten something bad that's making me see this hallucination, and he's comparing it to the toothpick, saying if I swallowed this toothpick, I'd get indigestion and pain the rest of my days, and that's a similar thing. So he's still not quite convinced that he's seeing Marley and thinks he's seeing things. At this, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chain with such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. "Mercy," he said, "dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge, "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man," the ghost returned, "that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world, oh woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness." So basically Marley's ghost gets really, really angry at Scrooge for not believing in him and basically scares him. And we get this kind of rather shocking, kind of grotesque description of his chin kind of flapping against his body, so this kind of rotting corpse. And we're told that, and a really interesting thing is this idea of, he's trapped in limbo. So the ghost saying that if you spent more time amongst his fellow men, so more time in society, thinking about the cares and worries that they have and helping and doing his fair share, he would have been allowed to have gone on to rest in peace. But instead, because he didn't do that, because he kept himself isolated from society, he's instead doomed to wander the world and see all the kind of the horrors and suffering in it. that he can't turn to happiness, that he can't do anything about. So the idea here is that Marley is trying to stop that happening to Scrooge. It's giving him one last chance to make changes. Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chain and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why?" "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know," pursued the ghost, "the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full as heavy as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You've laboured on it since. It is a ponderous chain." So Marley's ghost is basically telling Scrooge that the chains that's wearing around him, made up these money boxes and padlocks and things, are a kind of physical representation of his greed, and he's now carrying them as a kind of a punishment, as torture, to kind of teach him a lesson of what, how bad that greed really is. And what's happened is that the ghost is also saying that Scrooge, although he can't see it yet, is also wearing the same kind of chain. In fact, it's ponderous, it's huge. So ponderous chain, ponder to think, but it also mean ponderous in the sense of being heavy or a burden. So Marley is saying that the chain that he's going to wear when he passes on is far worse than the one he's carrying. So he's trying now to do something about it and help Scrooge make changes. Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. "Jacob," he said imploringly, "oh, Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak comfort to me, Jacob." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting-house, mark me. In life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me." So basically saying that because he spent all his time and his efforts purely within the counting-house with Scrooge, always focused on money, he's now doomed to kind of walk the earth widely now for a long, long time, because he hasn't kind of cared about other people. And he's saying that he can't give Scrooge any kind of comfort because essentially Scrooge is headed towards the same fate, the same judgment. So when he talks about other ministers, he's saying that the comfort that's going to be given to him can only really come from God and from the other spirits that have been sent to him to kind of teach him. But he's also saying that the comfort is only really due to other kinds of men. So basically people who are less greedy and stingy and nasty than Marley and Scrooge. But this is still an opportunity for Scrooge to kind of learn to begin to change his ways. It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering on what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees. "You must have been very slow about it, Jacob," Scrooge observed in a business-like manner, though with humility and deference. "Slow," the ghost repeated. 7 years dead," mused Scrooge, "and travelling all the time?" "The whole time," said the ghost. "No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse." So incessant just means unending, ceaseless, continuous. So he's, we're being told kind of the extent of the limbo he's in now. The fact that he's had to keep walking continuously for 7 years, seeing the suffering in the world, shows us just how much Marley detached himself from the world at large, and indeed just how much Scrooge is doing likewise. The idea that these two very greedy, selfish men have a lot to learn. "You travel fast," said Scrooge. "On the wings of the wind," replied the ghost. "You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years," said Scrooge. The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have been justified in indicting it for a nuisance. "Oh, captive bound in double iron," cried the phantom, "not to know the ages of incessant labour by mortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunities misused. Yet such was I. Oh, such was I." So basically Marley's saying that he's learned the hard way that people have all these opportunities to do good in the world, but they misuse their opportunities. They don't take advantage of them. And he's regretting it now, and he's kind of paying a huge price for it too. He's wandering the earth in limbo, seeing the suffering in the world and learning the things that he could have done to put things right and make things better. This idea that we should all try and develop a society around us, very much the moral of the story. "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," faltered Scrooge, who now began to apply this to himself. "Business!" cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." So what Marley's ghost is saying is that he neglected the true business of his life, the common welfare, so wider society and the needs of the poor. He neglected to be charitable and merciful, to be tolerant of others and being kind. Benevolence means kindness. So he's realised that actually the things that he was interested in were just a drop of water in the ocean of all of his responsibilities. So essentially saying that money just really isn't that important. It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. "At this time of the rolling year," the spectre said, "I suffer most. Why did I walk through crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down, and never raise them to that blessed star which led the wise men to a poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which its light would have conducted me?" So he's referring here, of course, to the Christmas story, the idea of the star that leads the wise men to the birthplace of Jesus, and the idea of the light leading people on to truth and justice and knowledge and better things. But he's saying that rather than look to the stars and be led by goodness, he had his eyes downcast on the floor because he was only really interested in himself. But now, of course, the exclamatives that we see everywhere show us the scale of his regret and remorse. Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly. "Hear me," cried the ghost. "My time is nearly gone." "I will," said Scrooge, "but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray." "How it is that I appear before you in a shape that you can see, I may not tell. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day." It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. So what we're learning here is that Marley's been haunting Scrooge for quite some time. "That is no light part of my penance," pursued the ghost. "I'm here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate, a chance and hope of my procuring Ebenezer." "You are always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "Thank ye." "You will be haunted," resumed the ghost, "by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost's had done. So he's basically penance comes from penitence, this idea of seeking forgiveness, and he's trying now to work, essentially work for God to teach Scrooge a lesson. So he's procuring means to take something, to get something. So basically, the ghost has managed to get this opportunity for Scrooge. So God has sent Marley's ghost to see Ebenezer and give him this chance to see him, so that he can impart these lessons. And Marley's warning him now that he's going to be visited by 3 other spirits who's going to basically teach him a lesson. But rather than be pleased by this, Scrooge's countenance, his facial expression falls really low. So he's a little bit put off by this, a little bit perturbed and scared by it. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visit," said the ghost, "you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take 'em all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. So he hasn't really changed yet. He's saying he's prepared to learn to change, but the way in which he wants to just rush everything and see it all in one go and get it over and done with shows us that really he's still quite dismissive. He hasn't really embraced the idea that he needs to change. So this is why we see the succession of ghosts, one after the other, each one bringing Scrooge closer and closer to that moment of transformation. Expect the second on the next night at the same hour. The third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound of its teeth made when the jaws were brought together by the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backward from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, warning him to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience as in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand he became sensible of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak dark night. So, basically, Marley's ghost has left him. A dirge, instantly, is a sad, miserable song, usually sort of sung at a funeral. So we get this kind of melancholy tone being created, just to kind of reinforce the idea of Marley's spirit as being one in penitence and regret and remorse as it kind of wanders the earth, paying for its sins. And again, still linked to the idea of bleak, dark night. So the idea of ignorance and, all those things that are associated with Scrooge. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in his curiosity, he looked out. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, they might be guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Now this is really, really important. It's this idea that the ghosts that Scrooge sees out of the window, so Bob Marley is one of many, many of such spirits wandering the earth. Their suffering is being forced to confront the hardships and misery of other people and not being able to help, even though they really want to. Because, of course, the lesson here is that you can't leave it till after you've gone. You need to do good in the world while you're alive. That's your real purpose for being here. So there is a very strong lesson in the story, and we call that a didactic message. So didacticism is the idea of teaching. So if something's didactic, which is an adjective, it means it's teaching you something. So this kind of moment story is quite didactic, this idea that we need to support each other while we're alive. We need to step in and help the poor, help the needy when we have the opportunity in life, and not leave it till it's too late. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell, but they and their spirit voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable, and being, from the emotion he had undergone, or the fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. So that concludes Stave 1. So now he's going to be visited by each of the spirits in turn, who are going to show him the error of his ways and hopefully teach him a lesson. So what would be a good idea is to have a think about how Scrooge is introduced to the reader as a character. So we'll have a look at a little extract and just consider how we might turn that into a paragraph. Let's take a closer look at this extract here. So we've read it early on. We talked briefly about the way in which this list of uncomfortable, painful words is used to emphasize that kind of the nastiness, the kind of the painful, unpleasant nature of Scrooge. We talked about the similes like hard and sharp as flint, that kind of hardness and sharpness, which makes him seem quite a nasty, unpleasant character. We talked about the kind of the similes, him being like an oyster, kind of completely isolated. And we also talked about the semantic feel of cold and the dark and the things that kind of associate him with ignorance and kind of quite uncomfortable things. So what can we do with that in terms of actually writing something about our first impressions? Well, the first thing we need, of course, is to have a better range of vocabulary for talking about Scrooge. So one of the things we need to try and do is move our kind of language away from kind of the everyday kind of vocabulary, saying things like Scrooge is unpleasant, or he's mean, or he's unsociable, rude and selfish, or that he's a rich man, and trying to use more sophisticated language, which kind of gives a more positive impression when you're writing about it in an exam. So instead of saying that Scrooge is unpleasant, you could say he's disagreeable. Instead of saying he's mean, you could say he's cold-hearted. Instead of saying he's unsociable, he's detached, and so on. Right, even small tweaks can make a difference. Instead of saying he's a rich man, you can say he's a wealthy man. But really what we're trying to do is to push towards an academic tier of vocabulary. This is the tier 3 stuff, the more advanced words. So instead of saying he's disagreeable, say he's objectionable. An objection is when you've got a complaint or a criticism. And of course, his lack of care for society is objectionable. Instead of saying that he's cold-hearted or mean, because he's callous. Callous kind of also has that implication of cruelty and nastiness to it. He's not just being cold-hearted, there's a kind of a cruel element to it. Instead of saying someone's unsociable, we could say he's aloof, he's kind of removed from society and their cares, and so on. So we're going to try and use some of this vocabulary. One thing to be aware of, and this one's a more kind of technical term, is this idea of libertarianism. So this is kind of tied into the idea of, well, to put it simply, kind of the free market. So this idea that we should all be self-reliant, we should all be kind of looking out for number one. We mentioned that word individualist and individualism earlier. Well, libertarianism is kind of connected to that. So Scrooge is a libertarian. He believes that the individual has the rights and the freedoms to kind of make money for themselves and to work for themselves, and has no responsibility really to others. So again, very much an academic word. Instead of saying that he's rich, you could say he's an oligarch. An oligarch's a wealthy, powerful person, or you could say oligarchic, which is the adjective. So these are the kind of words we need to start moving towards. But even if you start using some of the vocab from tier 2 and a few from tier 3, that's already going to improve some of your writing. Right, so one thing that can be really useful is to have a look at some of the language more closely from that extract. So we talked about the idea of hard and sharp as flint as being a simile. What word we could use to describe Scrooge? Well, if we go back to our earlier kind of table, well, let's start with something quite simple. We can say that the kind of the language here, it sounds like it's quite mean and unpleasant. So let's try something like callous. And why is it callous? What's cruel about it? Well, flint, I'm just going to use this as a note. It's sharp, painful, which suggests he hurts others in his behaviour. Okay. What about this one? Squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Well, we've got this list of violent verbs. And what word would be good for those? Well, again, that we could go with something like callous there. We could go something more simple. We could say something very unpleasant about it and something very disagreeable. Let's take disagreeable. He's a disagreeable man, right? Because this list of violent verbs are quite painful, uncomfortable, which make us sound like we don't want to be in his company. We want to avoid him. Right. No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle, no children asked him what it was o'clock, no man or woman ever once in his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. So we have this repetition of no beggars, no children, no man or woman. So these sentence structures are kind of repeated. So we get the same opening, the same beginning to each of these phrases. So we call this anaphora. So anaphora is where you use the same, so in this case, no. So the same opening words in the series of phrases. If that makes sense. So what's that telling us? Well, it shows us no one wants to talk to him. No one wants to be near him. So he's quite kind of unsociable and isolated. He's detached, but it's more that, other people are isolating him as well. So we could say that he's detached from the world, but we could also say that he's been ostracized, he's been kind of pushed away by others. So we'll say that he's isolated for now. He's all on his own. Right, people avoid him because his behavior is, what should we say? His behavior is unacceptable, is unpleasant, is awful. And again, this idea that they're teaching a lesson, that no one wants to be around such a person. Right, we had the imagery here. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. So we have imagery of temperature. And the idea of cold being linked to Scrooge and associated with his character. So we could say cold-hearted. It might be a little bit too literal, but I think we can go for something quite, we can just go for something like unpleasant for this. We don't have to always use tier 2 or 3. We can mix it up a little bit. So he's an unpleasant character. All right, cold symbolises his cold heart. Right, what about this? The foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely and Scrooge never did. Well, if you use weather to reflect the feelings of a character, we call that pathetic fallacy. So we've been told that he's a miserable character. So miserable. If we want something a bit more advanced from one of the other two, melancholic. Melancholy. So miserable gives us the adjective melancholic. So he's a melancholic character, quite miserable in his suffering. So the weather reflects his misery and suffering, but it is entirely brought upon himself. So these are just some kind of initial ideas. If you're planning to kind of write about an extract, it's often a good thing to do is to just begin with some quotes. Pick out some interesting language features and think, okay, what makes them interesting? What kind of language techniques can you spot amongst them? And then what might you say about those? Ignore my random use of capitalization or otherwise. The only important thing here are the ideas, but starting off with notes like this can often help you then to develop them into some more detail. So what I would suggest you do is take some of these ideas and run with them. See if you can turn them into a paragraph exploring how Dickens introduces Scrooge to us, and thinking about some of the ideas we've talked through in these sessions. But otherwise, that concludes things for this session. I hope you found it useful, either for studying the novel or revising it ahead of your exam. But otherwise, take care and bye for now.